Hey Potters, welcome back to the Pottery Plus studio. I thought we would talk a little bit today about the difference between Greenware and Bisqueware, meaning your pieces that have been completed and dried out before they've been fired, and then how they're different after and how you can tell the difference. The reason why it's important to be able to identify these two different states of your pottery is for a couple of reasons. One is that when your clay is still green, so it's completely dried out but it's unfired, it can still turn back into clay. So I could take this Greenware and I could put it into a bucket of water and it would turn back into slurry that I could then use a slip or try to let it dry out a bit and work it back into usable clay. If I take a piece of Bisqueware though and I put this into water, it's not budging, it's not going anywhere. So that's one main difference between Greenware and Bisqueware that's important to know. And kind of an interesting pottery fun fact about that is what causes that like curing to happen is a chemical reaction by the clay to the heat of the kiln, which is really kind of cool because it's like it literally changes it changes it from one material to another. So a water soluble material to a non-water soluble material. So it's just kind of a cool little tip about that. Now, one reason why it would be important to know this, particularly if you're working in a group studio, would be if there's a recycling program for the clay at the studio where you're working, you're gonna need to know what can go into the recycling program and what cannot. And so when I worked at an art center, it would happen so often, like I'd say once a quarter, there would be a piece of Bisqueware sitting on top of the recycled clay scraps that were sitting there waiting to be rehydrated and remade into workable clay. And all the employees at the art center, that really peeved us. But what can happen if a piece of Bisqueware goes into a recycling or a reclaim bucket and nobody catches it is because, again, it's no longer water soluble anymore. It can just basically it's going to turn into shards and damage the equipment, and if that batch of clay gets through and it's not identified that there's Bisqueware in it, it can actually hurt people. So that's one reason why it's really good to know the difference between the two states and be able to identify them, is if you're working in a scenario like that. The other reason is if you're getting ready to glaze and you think that your piece has been bisqued, but it's not, the glaze can kind of mess up your piece on a variety of different levels. Now, if you were just brushing a glaze onto a piece of Greenware, you could maybe get away with that and maybe you'd catch it soon enough that you could kind of resolve it. But if you were, say, like for example, dipping or spraying glaze onto Greenware, it's basically gonna start to disintegrate and break apart or just kind of melt apart. So, and I know this seems like, for my seasoned potters out there, this might be like, why is this a topic that's even being covered? But I try to think about things that I saw a lot that happened at the art center that beginners would kind of need clarification on. And this is one of those topics. So how can you tell the difference between a piece of Greenware and a piece of Bisqueware? So the first thing I would say is, again, if you're working in a group studio, those two states of your projects are probably going to have different locations in the studio, okay? But that was true at the studio where I worked, and it would still happen that people would get them mixed up. So a couple of ways to verify that you've got the right piece for the correct purpose that you're working on. So Greenware, because it is not fully cured yet, it's not fully until after the glaze fire, but because it hasn't gone through its first round of firing, the clay can still slough off the surface. So if you rub your finger on it and you get some clay dust on your finger, that's telling you that clay is still, it's not like fully cured. That's why it can still kind of slough off. With a piece of bisque, unless there's just dust in the studio hanging around, you should get really no dust or very little, not to where it's like scraping off the surface. That's one way. The other thing is the color. So you can see that the clay I'm working with, the Greenware is a bit more gray, the Bisqueware is more white. So usually the bisque is gonna be lighter, and I feel like when I was working at the art studio, the bisque always had, and this is true every studio that I've been in, it always has in person kind of like a pink or like a coral, just barely like tinge to it. So I don't know, maybe not everybody sees it that way. I had students who would say they didn't see the pink tinge, but I always felt like they all just looked a little bit pinkish. So that's one way, is visually by the color. Next, you can check out the sound that they're making. Okay, so Greenware is gonna make kind of a thud. Okay, Bisqueware will have a ting to it. Like that. So if it's tingy, it's bisqued. And then finally, the last thing that you can always do is like ask somebody, ask your instructor, double check. That's what I always used to say to my students is like, if all of these little tests that I give you fly out the window, just wait and ask someone around you or me or whoever can verify for you that your work is indeed Greenware or Bisqueware, okay? Because it's, you know, for the reasons that I've talked about, it's kind of important to know the difference. And again, surprisingly, something that I've seen trip people up. And, you know, friends, I think it's easy to say like, well, if you can't tell the difference between Greenware and Bisqueware, you're just, I don't know, fill in the blanks. Sometimes people weren't very nice about it. Like when those people would accidentally put Bisqueware into the recycling bin, myself included. I will not say that I was always a saint, but you know, having learned about beginner students and had so much experience with beginner students, these are the kinds of little things that can be just not on the radar because there's so much going on. If you're new to being in an art studio or a pottery studio, this is just the kind of stuff that can get forgotten or overlooked. So here's your reminder. Know your difference between Bisqueware and Greenware, and you're doing great. Keep going, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, pottery people.